What if the massive stone steps lying deep beneath the waters of Japan were not the work of nature at all, but the remains of a forgotten civilization that thrived long before the Ice Age ended? If that were true, it would mean that entire chapters of human history have been left out of the story we tell ourselves. Legends of lost cities and drowned kingdoms, so often dismissed as myth, might instead be faint memories of real catastrophes, half buried beneath the waves of time. This mystery began in 1986, when a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake was scouting for new spots to bring tourists off the coast of Yonaguni, a small island at the far southwestern edge of Japan. At a depth of about 80 feet, he stumbled upon something entirely unexpected. Massive stone formations rising from the seabed, carved into terraces and platforms, with edges that seemed too sharp, too deliberate to be the product of erosion alone. In that moment, the calm waters of Yonaguni revealed a secret that would soon ignite one of the greatest debates in modern archaeology. Nearly a decade later, in 1995, the site drew the attention of Professor Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus. After years of diving at Yonaguni, Kimura announced his belief that the underwater structures were not natural rock formations, but the ruins of a man-made complex. He pointed to what looked like staircases, flat terraces, and angular corners, features that to him suggested intentional design rather than random geology. His claims made headlines across Japan and quickly spread abroad. Some journalists began calling Yonaguni Japan's Atlantis, while others described it as a sunken pyramid, built by an unknown people thousands of years before recorded civilization. The announcement sent ripples far beyond the diving community. Archaeologists, geologists, and curious travelers all turned their eyes to Yonaguni. Could this submerged landscape be the remains of an ancient city swallowed by the sea? Or was it nothing more than a natural wonder, an illusion created by the meeting of rock and water? Even today, nearly 40 years after Aratake's discovery, the debate continues without a clear resolution. And yet the questions linger. If the structures were truly man-made, who built them? How could a people so ancient have shaped such massive stone platforms? And what purpose would a site of that scale have served? Most of all, how did it end up 25 meters beneath the ocean's surface, locked away in silence for millennia? Every dive at Yonaguni seems to raise more mysteries than answers. The site has become a symbol of the fragile boundary between science and legend, between what we know and what we have yet to discover. Some see in its stones the fingerprints of a forgotten world, while others caution that nature itself can craft shapes as deceiving as any myth. But imagine, just for a moment, that Yonaguni really is a remnant of a civilization erased by the sea. What else might we be missing? How many more stories of our origins remain hidden beneath rising oceans and shifting earth? In this video, we will journey into the depths of Yonaguni, exploring what has been uncovered, what remains unexplained, and why some believe it may be the strongest evidence yet that humanity has forgotten entire civilizations. If you enjoy mysteries like this, where history and legend blur into one another, make sure to subscribe and stay with me until the end. For now, let us drift slowly into the waters of Yonaguni and let the story carry you gently towards sleep. Far to the southwest of Japan, where the islands of the Ryukyu chain scatter across the sea, lies Yonaguni. It is a small island, only a few miles across, but its position is dramatic. On a clear day, the ridges of Taiwan appear on the horizon, and the waters around Yonaguni are swift and restless, famous for strong currents and coral reefs. The land rises steeply from the sea, its cliffs battered by storms, its interior marked by rolling hills and wild grasses. For most of its history, Yonaguni has been quiet, a place on the edge of nations, where fishing boats trace the same routes their ancestors once followed. Beneath those waters, at a depth of 25 meters, lies a formation that few could have imagined until divers saw it with their own eyes. In 1986, Kihachiro Aratake swam above the southern coast and noticed the shapes below him. Terraces that fell away in steps, walls that ran straight into the sand, angles that seemed too precise to belong entirely to nature. He had no answer for what he saw, only the certainty that it was extraordinary. Word spread among divers, and soon Yonaguni became a place of pilgrimage for those drawn to mysteries hidden by the sea. What followed was the beginning of a long and uncertain journey. In 1997, scientists from the Japan Marine Science and Technology Center arrived to examine the site. They lowered their instruments, studied the stone, and returned with a conclusion that was sober and careful. The formation, they said, was made of sandstone and mudstone, the kind of rock that often breaks into flat plains. Wind, water, and tectonic stress could shape it further, creating steps, ledges, and right angles. To the team, this was the work of the Earth alone. It was an answer that explained the geology, yet for many it left the mystery unresolved. The shapes were there, regardless of how they came to be. Long before geologists dived beneath the waves, the people of Okinawa spoke of places swallowed by the sea. In 1917, their stories were written down in Tokyo, in a collection of folklore. Among tales of storms and spirits were accounts of drowned cities, villages that had once stood proud before being lost to the ocean. For centuries these had been only legends. They were told in the evenings as reminders of the sea's power, warnings passed from one generation to the next. Yet when the steps of Yonaguni were revealed, the old words seemed less like imagination and more like fragments of memory. Could it be that the stories carried shadows of real events, carried across centuries like echoes in a shell? By the turn of the new century, one man had become the voice of a different perspective. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, had spent years exploring the site. With each dive, he grew more convinced that the stones were not only natural. In 2001, he offered a daring estimate. The formations, he suggested, could date to nearly 10,000 years before the Common Era, a time when ice still gripped much of the northern world. Seas were lower then. Shorelines stretched far beyond their present borders, and places that are now drowned lay open to the air. If Kimura was right, Yonaguni had once been dry land, a stage for human activity long before recorded history. The idea was unsettling, because it did not fit within the usual timeline of civilization. Archaeology speaks of villages and cities rising thousands of years later, of farming and monuments that emerged much closer to the present. To place Yonaguni so far back was to suggest that people had been shaping stone in organized ways while glaciers were still retreating. In 2007, Kimura's team added new images to the debate. Using sonar and three-dimensional mapping, they traced the outlines of what seemed to be a grand boulevard. It ran for nearly 150 meters, bordered by terraces that looked almost architectural. To divers, moving along this underwater path was like walking a road in silence, as if the waves had preserved a forgotten town. The images stirred imagination across the world, and Yonaguni became more than a local curiosity. It was now a question that touched on the story of all humanity. Beneath the argument, another current shaped the discussion, the rising of the seas themselves. In 1989, geologist William Fairbanks published research that charted how oceans rose at the end of the last ice age. From around 20,000 years before the Common Era to 8,000 years before the Common Era, the seas climbed by nearly 120 meters. This was not a slow and gentle process. At times the water surged upward in sudden leaps, as ice sheets melted and rivers of fresh water poured into the oceans. Around 9,600 years before the Common Era, near the end of the Younger Dryas Cold Period, one such pulse drowned coastlines in what may have felt like the blink of an eye. For people living near the shore, the change would have been terrifying. Entire plains disappeared, valleys became bays, and whatever stood there was lost beneath the waves. To imagine Yonaguni in that world is to imagine a place at the edge of survival. The island itself rests in a region of tectonic energy, where earthquakes can shift the earth without warning. Storms sweep in from the Pacific, pounding cliffs and reshaping the land. The sea both provides and threatens, a companion and a destroyer. If people once lived among the terraces, they would have watched as their world changed around them, as the waters crept higher, as the currents pulled stronger. The same ocean that fed them could one day take everything away. Divers today swim along those same terraces. They see the stones softened by corals, the lines blurred by currents, the silence of a place that holds no voices, only the sound of bubbles rising toward the light above. Scientists continue to measure and debate, weighing sandstone against symmetry, erosion against intention. The arguments shift like the tide, never fully settling. Still listening? Please give this video a like to support us. If the Yonaguni formations were crafted by human hands, then they stand as a record of what an early society could imagine and achieve. The stones do not only suggest shapes, they suggest order, labour, and belief, speaking of a people who turned raw cliffs into architecture and carved meaning into their world. The first sense of scale came in 1998, when divers charted a feature that soon became known as the Boulevard. They measured its length at nearly 150 metres, a corridor broad enough to dwarf the divers themselves, stretching straight across the seafloor. Its width of 20 metres gave the impression of a gathering place, and the steps that rose along its edges climbed 2 metres high. It was not the kind of space designed for a single family or small group. It looked like the spine of a settlement, a place where processions might have passed, where voices could have gathered in chorus, where the heart of a community had once been laid out in stone. The boulevard suggested more than stonework, it suggested vision. To create such a space, people would need not only the strength to quarry and shape rock, but also the ability to plan, to measure distance, to organize many hands toward a single design. The steps rising at the boulevard's edges felt like the framework of ceremony. They seemed built for order, guiding the flow of people as they ascended and descended together. In that breadth of stone, one could sense the echo of a society that valued unity, that sought permanence, that marked its existence in lines too large to ignore. Among those terraces, in 2000, divers reported something different. On one block lay the outline of a turtle, its shape distinct against the flat plain surrounding it. Close by were marks that looked like carvings of animals. If these were deliberate, they turned the stone from structure into story. The turtle has long been a sacred image across cultures, a creature of patience and stability. In East Asian tradition, it guards the compass directions and represents endurance. In other myths, it carries the world upon its back. To carve such a symbol into Yonaguni's stone was to place faith in the sea itself, to acknowledge the creatures that lived within it, to tie human fate to the ocean's strength. These carvings suggested more than artistry, they spoke of ritual. A turtle block may have served as a shrine, a focus for prayers before fishermen pushed their boats into the current. Animal shapes carved into stone may have been reminders of myths retold at gatherings, stories that bound the community together. The carvings were small when compared to the boulevard, but they gave the architecture its soul. They showed that those who worked the stone did not labour only for function, they laboured for meaning, leaving behind symbols that carried belief across generations. The combination of scale and symbolism linked Yonaguni in the minds of some with other monumental traditions. In 1995, author Graham Hancock had already described in Fingerprints of the Gods how great works in Peru and Egypt might point to a forgotten lineage of human knowledge. When word of Yonaguni spread, readers saw the Japanese site as another piece of that vision, a boulevard beneath the Pacific, echoing fortress walls in the Andes, terraces mirroring the great blocks of the Nile. To them, Yonaguni was not isolated. It was part of a greater story of human ambition, a reminder that societies long ago had the will and skill to move mountains of stone. Closer to the rock itself, the evidence of craft continued to appear. In 2002, Kimura's laboratory studied sediments collected from the site. Within them they found chips and flakes that seemed to bear the marks of striking, patterns more in line with deliberate toolwork than with the slow abrasion of currents. Such marks suggested the use of stone hammers, chisels, and wedges. Builders may have heated stone with fire, then cooled it with water to split it along chosen lines. They may have driven wooden pegs into cracks, soaking them until they expanded and forced the rock apart. These methods required patience and knowledge, a tradition of building passed from one worker to another. To imagine them at Yonaguni is to imagine a community with engineers in all but name, people who knew how to bend the stubborn stone into form. Even scholars who resisted the idea of an ancient city found it hard to ignore some of the details. In 2004, archaeologist Shunichi Nakamura examined the site. He did not declare Yonaguni to be artificial, for he noted the absence of pottery, bones, or weapons that often mark a settlement. Yet he acknowledged that certain cut lines appeared too precise to dismiss. Straight edges and right angles stood where natural fracture seemed less likely. His words, cautious as they were, admitted that the stone carried puzzles not easily solved by geology alone. Through these observations, the outlines of a society begin to take shape. The boulevard reveals a capacity for large-scale planning, an ability to create civic or ceremonial space. The turtle block and animal carvings show a culture with spiritual depth, one that tied its survival to symbols of the sea. The tool marks in the sediment speak of technology, of methods for shaping stone that required both craft and organization. The cut lines noticed by Nakamura suggest a precision of hand, a careful guiding of fractures into forms that reflected intention. In such a place, daily life may have unfolded with both rhythm and reverence. Families may have lived in dwellings nearby, now long lost to the ocean, while gathering on the terraces for ceremonies. Fishermen may have prayed at the turtle shrine before setting out, returning to share their catch on the wide steps. Workers may have carried tools to the cliff, splitting rock in the heat of the day. Elders may have guided processions along the boulevard, their voices echoing against the stone as children traced carvings with their hands. The society that shaped Yonaguni's stones lived between the practical and the sacred, between the labour of building and the meaning carved into every mark. Do you think these ruins were made by human hands or shaped by nature? Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know why. The sea around Yonaguni holds its silence, but above the waves, voices argue endlessly about what lies below. Since its discovery, the site has been more than stone. It has become a question posed to history itself. Was this a natural formation, or the ruins of a civilization long forgotten? The answers are divided, and each new decade has added another layer to the debate. The first great leap into legend came in 1996. That year, British author Colin Wilson released a book titled From Atlantis to the Sphinx. Wilson was already known for exploring the borderlands of myth and archaeology, and when he saw reports of Yonaguni, he made a daring claim. He called it the Asian Atlantis. With that phrase, the terraces off Japan were suddenly linked to Plato's ancient tale of a mighty city drowned in a single night. Wilson's words gave the site a mythic identity. For readers across Europe and America, Yonaguni was no longer an obscure reef. It was Atlantis reborn in the Pacific, a vision of a sunken world waiting to be acknowledged. While Wilson captured the imagination of readers abroad, in Japan the mystery was given a different kind of authority. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura had spent years diving among the formations, measuring their lines, charting their planes. By 2004, he was ready to describe what he believed he had found. To Kimura, these were not random shapes. He spoke of a small pyramid-like monument, a stone gate, even streets that seemed to run in order. From this, he imagined a lost settlement, perhaps home to several thousand people. His estimate transformed the formations from curiosity into community, a place with avenues, shrines, plazas, and inhabitants. A drowned city rather than an accident of rock. Newspapers in Japan carried his statements, and suddenly Yonaguni was front-page news. But the same year, the tide of skepticism rose. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, travelled to the site and returned with a very different story. To Schoch, the shapes were deceptive but natural. In interviews and lectures he spoke plainly. They look like structures, but they are not structures. In his judgment, the sandstone had fractured along natural planes, creating right angles, flat terraces, and sharp steps without any human hand. The features that thrilled divers were, to him, no more artificial than a canyon wall split by frost and rain. His verdict was cold, but it carried the weight of geology. For every pyramid and boulevard described by Kimura, Schoch offered fracture patterns and erosion. The clash between these voices only made Yonaguni more mysterious. Each diver who descended into the blue seemed to come back with a different story, and the site grew in reputation. By the following decade, the mystery reached even broader audiences. In 2013, Japan's national broadcaster NHK aired a program that gave Yonaguni yet another identity. This time the ruins were tied not to Atlantis but to Lemuria, a mythical continent once imagined to stretch across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The broadcast showed sweeping underwater shots, terraces glowing in the filtered light, as narrators spoke of vanished lands. Millions watched, and soon the program's images spread across the internet. On forums and websites, Yonaguni was presented as evidence hidden in plain sight, a relic of a world erased. Beyond Japan, the voice of Graham Hancock carried the mystery to still more readers. In his 2002 book, Underworld, The Mysterious Origins of Civilization, published before Kimura and Schoch had fully locked horns, Hancock had already placed Yonaguni at the center of his theory. He described how sea levels rose dramatically after the Ice Age, and how coastal settlements would have been swallowed whole. Among all the examples, he called Yonaguni the clearest, the smoking gun that proved advanced societies had lived and built long before conventional history allowed. His words turned the Japanese ruins into global evidence, cited in discussions of lost civilizations from India to the Americas. Yet mainstream science continued to stand firm. After renewed surveys, the Geological Society of Japan released its findings in 2015. Their conclusion was cautious but direct. No pottery had been recovered, no tools, no bones or signs of habitation. Without such evidence, they said, the formations could not be accepted as artificial. The shapes, they explained, matched the behavior of sandstone under stress. Straight lines, they argued, could be explained by orthogonal joints, natural fractures that often form in right angles. But even as they closed the case, their report carried one haunting line. Certain cuts, they admitted, remain difficult to explain. That phrase was enough to keep the mystery alive. To believers, it was a slip of truth, a sign that even official science could not fully dismiss the site. To skeptics, it was merely a reminder that geology, like history, has its puzzles. Either way, Yonaguni remained unsolved. If you are still here with us, press like so we know you are listening. If Yonaguni was once built by human hands, its disappearance must have been sudden and devastating. Researchers and storytellers alike have offered different scenarios. The facts we have suggest a combination of rising seas, shifting earth, and violent natural disasters. In 1999, Professor Masaki Kimura presented one of the earliest scientific hypotheses about Yonaguni's fate. He argued that the structures were drowned as sea levels rose rapidly at the end of the last ice age. His work referred to the sea level curve published by William Fairbanks in 1989, which showed that between 20,000 and 8,000 years before the Common Era, global seas climbed by nearly 120 meters. This immense rise matched the timing of the Younger Dryas, a climatic episode marked by dramatic floods of meltwater released into the oceans. Later, in 2010, a Stanford University team reinforced this model, showing that meltwater pulses could raise sea levels by several meters within just a few generations. According to Kimura, if Yonaguni had stood on dry land around 10,000 BCE, these surges would have overwhelmed it, slowly at first and then irreversibly, until the entire site lay beneath the waves. Another possibility came from geology itself. In 2001, a detailed survey of the seafloor around Yonaguni recorded fissures cutting through the sandstone. These cracks matched the known tectonic stress of the Ryukyu Arc, a boundary where the Philippine Sea Plate presses against the Eurasian Plate. The researchers concluded that Yonaguni might not have been lost only to rising seas, but also to subsidence. Entire shelves of rock could have shifted downward, carrying any structures with them. Instead of a slow drowning, the city might have been dragged beneath the surface by the motion of the Earth itself. The case for seismic destruction became stronger with later work. In 2006, a research group at Tokyo University studied the earthquake history of the Ryukyu region. They found evidence of repeated tremors strong enough to devastate coastal settlements. The conclusion was that if Yonaguni contained artificial terraces or walls, earthquakes of this scale would have fractured them long before modern divers arrived. The sandstone blocks visible today could be the ruins of such damage, collapsed platforms and shattered steps, broken not by human neglect but by violent shaking. The same study warned of the secondary effects of quakes, tsunamis rising from the seafloor, slamming into islands and sweeping entire towns away. For a community living by the sea, such a sequence could have meant complete destruction in a single event. Beyond geology, memory also plays a role. Among the people of Okinawa, legends have been passed down for centuries of a city taken by the ocean. These stories speak of a wave so large it swallowed streets, houses, and temples, leaving nothing behind. In 1917, one of the earliest published folklore collections in Tokyo recorded such accounts. The tale does not name Yonaguni, nor does it give a date, but the image is unmistakable. A settlement erased by a wall of water, a city remembered only in story. While legend cannot be equated with science, its survival into the 20th century suggests that memories of catastrophe, whether earthquake, tsunami, or flood, remained strong in the culture of the islands. Each of these explanations points to forces far greater than human control. The model of rising seas explains how coastlines across the world were redrawn as the Ice Age ended. The tectonic hypothesis shows how fragile island arcs can shift and collapse, altering landscapes in moments. The earthquake studies reveal that the region's seismic violence could topple even the most carefully built stone. And the folklore, however imprecise, adds the voice of those who lived with these dangers, preserving in myth the fear of being swallowed by the sea. What they share is the image of sudden loss, whether by slow drowning over centuries, by the ground collapsing, or by quakes and waves striking at once. The settlement, if it existed, did not endure. Unlike cultures that leave ruins on land, protected from time, Yonaguni would have faced the combined assault of water, earth, and fire. No walls or temples could withstand it. The evidence that remains today, fractures, terraces, ledges, can be read as geology or as the broken bones of architecture. In either case, the conclusion is the same. Whatever stood there is gone. Beneath the Pacific, Yonaguni rests in silence, but its story has continued to ripple far beyond the reefs of Okinawa. Its terraces raise questions of heritage, spark imagination, and echo with the warnings of a sea that has always tested human survival. In 1997, the formations reached the desks of Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs. Heritage status was normally reserved for castles, shrines, or temples with centuries of record. Yonaguni had none of that, only sandstone steps hidden beneath 25 meters of water. Some officials argued that even in uncertainty, it deserved protection. Others refused, saying mystery alone could not be placed beside Japan's great treasures. In the end, no recognition was given. Yet the debate itself left a mark. For the first time, the submerged terraces had entered the national memory, showing that heritage can sometimes begin with questions rather than answers. The story widened in 2008 when filmmaker Yutaka Nitta released The Undersea Ruins of Ryukyu. His cameras carried audiences deep below the surface, where wide ledges and sharp corners emerged in high definition. For those who watched, it was more than geology. Some saw a drowned city, others only the haunting beauty of stone shaped by the sea. Either way, imaginations were stirred. Artists sketched lost kingdoms, writers wove tales of civilizations swallowed by the Pacific. Designers built virtual worlds where players wandered through submerged corridors. Yonaguni spread across culture not through proof, but through wonder. In 2010, science gave the mystery a darker frame. Researchers at Stanford University modeled sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. Their results showed that oceans had surged upward by as much as 5 meters in a single century when glaciers collapsed. Such floods were not gradual. They were sudden enough to erase coastlines within a human lifetime. For those asking how Yonaguni came to rest beneath the waves, the numbers offered a chilling possibility. If people had once lived along its terraces, their homes would have vanished with terrifying speed. The ruins did not prove themselves a city, but they reminded us that life by the shore has always been fragile, then as now. The thought lingers today. Towers of glass and steel may feel immovable, yet the ocean has always proven stronger. The terraces beneath Okinawa stand as a quiet mirror, showing what the sea can take when it rises too quickly. In 2019, another chapter unfolded. Scientists from the University of Tokyo descended with laser scanners and underwater cameras. They traced every line of stone, turning ledges and platforms into glowing 3-dimensional models. Their mission was not to decide who built Yonaguni, but to ensure it would not vanish into silence. Today, those models allow students across the world to explore the ruins on screen, long after currents and erosion wear away the real sandstone. It is preservation without certainty, a reminder that memory itself can be safeguarded even when answers remain out of reach. Yonaguni does not settle arguments of origin, but it continues to remind us that the sea shapes the fate of coasts, that imagination thrives where certainty fails, and that mysteries we choose to preserve may outlast the truths we think we know. As the story of Yonaguni drifts into silence, it leaves behind more than stone steps beneath the Pacific. It leaves questions that reach far beyond Japan. In 2001, researchers announced sonar images off the coast of Cuba that seemed to show geometric shapes more than 600 meters below the surface. The formations were described as walls and avenues, as if another city had been left behind by the sea. A year later, in 2002, the waters of the Gulf of Kampat in India revealed strange structures as well, detected by marine surveys in a region once thought to have been uninhabited so early in history. Both discoveries remain disputed, caught between geology and the possibility of human hands. Placed beside Yonaguni, they form a haunting pattern. Japan, Cuba, India, 3 corners of the world, each with whispers of ruins submerged in the deep. If even one of them proves to be real, it means that civilizations older than we have imagined may have thrived and fallen long before the first written chronicles. And if more than one holds truth, then the story of human history as we know it might only be half told. That is the lingering question. How much have we lost to the sea, and how much of our past remains hidden beneath the waves? If these mysteries stir your imagination, share your thoughts in the comments. Could Yonaguni and other sunken ruins be lost cities, or only the work of nature? Subscribe for more forgotten histories, and let the stories guide you into sleep. Good night.